The Joseph Smith history found in the Pearl of Great Price is full of truth and testimony, and we as members of the church are very blessed to have it. What a wonderful source where we can read the prophet's words about some of the events surrounding the restoration of the church and to hear his testimony. Well, Joseph Smith's history found in the Pearl of Great Price is not comprehensive, and it's very brief, in fact. And so what I'm going to do is take an amateur attempt at telling you the stories behind the stories. There's a lot of detail and stories and miracles and wonderful things that are really neat to hear and understand that happened around each of the details that are contained in each verse in Joseph Smith's history. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take every verse out of the Joseph Smith history and tell you some of the stories behind the stories. So here we go. Verse 1 and 2, he just introduces himself and that he needs to write a journal, and here it comes. Verse 3 is where things start to get interesting. He says that he was born December 23rd, 1805 in Sharon, Vermont. He says a short time after that, the family moved to Palmyra, and an even shorter time after that, they finally settled in Manchester, New York. But man, the events surrounding those moves, the miracles that it took to get them to Palmyra and to Manchester are incredible, and it's a story worth knowing. But the story goes all the way back to England. It starts in 1638. A man by the name of Robert Smith, Joseph's ancestor, decides to sell to America. There was no such thing as America in 1638. He sells to the New World. He settles in Massachusetts, though, and he starts to farm and raise his family. Several generations of Smiths stay right there in town until finally Joseph Jr.'s grandfather decides to move. He moves to Turnbridge, Massachusetts, and continues to raise his family and produce from a farm. Well, it was in Turnbridge that Joseph's father, Joseph Sr., met Lucy. Lucy, Mack, and Joseph Sr. met, they fell in love, they decided to get married, and they decided to have a family of their own. Well, the only thing they knew how to do was farm, and so they wanted to farm, they needed to farm in order to provide for a family, but they didn't have any money, so they rented a piece of ground. Now, when you rent a piece of ground, it's a good idea, or it's a good understanding at least, that the land's not going to be very good. If it was good, the farmer wouldn't be renting it, he'd be utilizing it himself. But sure enough, the farmland wasn't any good. They weren't able to grow anything, so they knew that they needed to move on and find something else to do, and so, or a different place to do it. So they moved to Vermont. And in Vermont, they had a little farm. They were struggling, couldn't make ends meet, and Lucy gets sick, deathly sick, very, very sick. And so she prays to the Lord. Now, it's something about the Smiths. This is long before the church is restored. It's before even Joseph was born. But they had a testimony of Heavenly Father and the power of prayer. They knew and they taught their children that salvation comes only in and through Jesus Christ. They believed the Bible. They were good Christian people. And so she utilizes her faith and prays to Heavenly Father. She doesn't just ask for a prayer, though, with nothing in return. She promises that if the Lord will bless her to live, she will spend the rest of her life serving Him. Little did she know the covenant she was making, but she was good to it. The rest of her life, she served valiantly and diligently her Heavenly Father. Well, they got out of town. They needed to go find another way to provide for the family. Joseph Sr. Was introduced to a business idea, a business venture, and it had to do with the herb called ginseng. Ginseng is in New England, and the Chinese are crazy about it. So they decide, we're going to join in with some other business partners, gather up some ginseng, purchase some ginseng, and we're going to send it over to the Chinese, and we'll make a profit. However, his business partner, Mr. Howard, was a thief. He was a crook. He took all the ginseng and the Smiths' money and took off to Canada, never to be heard from again. Now the Smiths are penniless, they're in debt, and they've got nothing to do but do what they know how to do, and that's farm. And so they decide they need to go get another piece of ground. And so they head to Sharon, Vermont, where they're able to secure another piece of property. There, it's in Sharon, Vermont, that Joseph would be born. The farm doesn't work. It's not able to produce a crop, and so they move again, looking for another better piece of ground. This time, they move to West Lebanon. West Lebanon is in New Hampshire. They start to grow a farm there, but they get distracted because of the typhoid fever. The typhoid fever hit their town, and it hit it hard. It was killing a lot of people. The Smiths were not immune to it. Joseph's sister, Sophronia, acquired the typhoid and got very sick. They prayed over her. They prayed for a blessing from Heavenly Father. Their prayers were heard and answered, and Sophronia got better. It was also in West Lebanon where Joesph had difficulty with his leg. They figured it was some sort of a strain of the typhoid infected his leg, and which would require that miraculous surgery that saved his leg. He didn't have to be amputated. He eventually was able to heal and use it. Although with a slight limp, he was able to use it the rest of his life to do the work of our Heavenly Father. Well, they got out of West Lebanon, New Hampshire, before the typhoid could have any other negative effects on the Smith family. They ended up in Vermont. The first year, they tried to plant, or they did plant. They tried to have a harvest. There wasn't much of anything. The second year, the harvest is what Lucy called dismal. It didn't produce much of anything at all. And the following year, the third year they were in this town, is the infamous 1800 and froze to death. That was the name of the year, or the year without a summer. You see, they got the crop in, things started to look good, and then in June, a frost came, wiped everything out. They hurried, got the crop back in again, it started to produce. In July, a frost came and knocked everything out. Same thing happened in August. Now, we wouldn't understand until over 100 years later what happened. And what did happen is Mount Tambora in Indonesia, a volcano, blew its top, throwing ash and soot and smoke and everything else into the stratosphere. All that stuff came over and settled right over New England and essentially blocked out the sun long enough to kill all the harvest and to change the weather pattern so that it was snowy and frosty in the summertime back in New England. Well, things weren't looking up for the Smiths. Just at that time, Joesph Sr. saw an advertisement in the newspaper advertising inexpensive, wonderful, fertile, farmable land way out west. So Joesph Sr. by himself headed way out west to a little town called Palmyra, New York. Sure enough, the advertisement was right. There was good land out here. Joesph saw that there was wonderful potential, so he called to Lucy and had her bring the children and meet him there in Palmyra, where they would start a family and essentially continue with the family they had, but they would start over and try to make a farm out of this wonderful land that they're going to try to secure. Well, they make their way to Palmyra, and they start to settle and do just that. Now, let's take for a moment and put this whole Smith story to the side, and I want to tell you another story, and you'll see how they relate. This one's about Moroni, the last prophet historian in the Book of Mormon. Moroni takes the plates from Mormon, or is given the plates from Mormon in the year 385 AD. And he goes and he doesn't bury them until 421 AD. In those 36 years, not only is he abridging the record of the Jaredites and adding in his own history in the Book of Moroni, but he's also doing something else. He tells us what that is. He says that he's wandering whithersoever I can for the safety of my own life. And why is he running for his life? Because the Lamanites will put to death anyone who will not deny the Christ, and I, Moroni, will not deny the Christ. So he's on the run. Where is he running from? We don't know. Where is he running to? We know exactly where. That hill in Manchester, New York, where he would put the plates in the year 421 AD. Now, he was all over the place. We do know that because Brigham said that he dedicated the future temple sites of Manti and St. George. Joesph also said that Moroni dedicated the temple sites for the temple in the Great Basin, the Salt Lake Valley, Independence, Kirtland, and many other temples we know not yet of. So we know that he was making the rounds and moving back and forth and covering a lot of ground. But eventually he ended up in that hill. Now let's bring our two stories together. I've just told you that the Smiths, for many years, were running all over New England trying to get a farm to work, and it couldn't happen. It eventually led them to Palmyra. I've told you that Moroni was running for his life all over the place and eventually ended up at the hill in 421 AD. Although separated by 1,500 years or so, the Lord was able to bring the Smith family and Moroni within just 3 miles of each other. Now imagine for a moment if these good Christian people who believed in God, believed in the Bible, did everything that they thought Heavenly Father wanted them to do in order to qualify for a blessing. What if one of their prayers had been answered? What if the Lord had provided the blessing that they were asking for when they were asking for it? What if the crop worked? What if there was no typhoid? They would have never made it to Palmyra. But they did make it to Palmyra, and I think Joesph recognized the miracle of it all in his history when he says that the hill was conveniently located to his home. The Lord brings these two parties within 3 miles of each other, although separated by 1,500 years, in preparation for his work to move forward. Now, if the Lord can do all of that for the Smith family and for Moroni, just imagine what he could do for you and me. So that's verse 3. I'm going to take you through every verse in the history and tell you the stories behind the stories. I think you'll find them to be pretty interesting and pretty incredible, and most importantly, it'll lead you to understand that this is the work of Jesus Christ. Joseph Smith was his prophet. For more videos about our church history, make sure to subscribe.